Test drive. The very same franchise that began the 1990s as the most innovative and influential racing game ever released, ended the same decade disgraced and discarded. Never has a franchise been so quick to dilute and eventually ruin its identity and reputation. But in 2006, after spending 15 years and over 24 releases straddling the line between half-hearted and horrible, Test Drive resurfaced. Not only with a new game, but a new developer, and a new direction. Rising from the ashes of its namesake, Eden Games' new creation didn't just match its direct competition. It pushed the genre forward in ways that defined how racers will be made for decades to come. This is Test Drive Unlimited. To some, driving is a chore, a thing they have to do every day, like brushing their teeth or doing the dishes. To others, it's one of the greatest pleasures on Earth. Automobiles are machines, inanimate objects, yet they possess so much character, so much personality, all imposed by the designers and engineers that bring them to life. Cars are purpose-built for humans to control, but there's more to it than that. You tell the car what to do, and the car talks back. It communicates in a language that you feel. Its words are silent, but tactile. Tactile. That's a word I've found myself coming back to a lot lately. Not just in reference to Test Drive, either. One of the biggest challenges in making a game feel right is replicating the things you can't see or hear. Weight, speed, a sense of space. The snappy kick of a firearm in Modern Warfare, or the subtle camera shifts in Titanfall. These things look good, but more importantly, they serve gameplay purposes. In both of these cases, the animations and the way they interact with the game's other systems create an effortless immersion, a connection between the player and the avatar they control. But in Test Drive, you're not shooting guns, and if I'm being honest, the sense of speed isn't great either. Make no mistake, this game is not perfect, and it's definitely aged in the 15 years since its release. But there is one thing that Test Drive Unlimited gets right that no other game has since, and I suspect that those who have played it are nodding along in agreement. What makes Unlimited special is the painstaking attention to the small, grounded details. TDU takes the type of things that most games disregard as boring and unimportant, and instead places them center stage. Aspects of car ownership that are hand-waved away by the likes of Need for Speed are instead embraced by Unlimited as core mechanics. Where do you buy your cars? What options do they come with? What color's the interior? Where do you keep these cars when you're not driving them? Where does the player character go when they're not racing? Every one of these questions is answered within Unlimited's first 15 minutes. You catch a flight to Hawaii, rent a car at the airport, drive to a dealership, and pick the factory options on your own set of wheels. But before you get to race it, you've got to hit up a realtor and purchase a house. A house with a modeled interior, a unique name, and a garage for your cars. There's no universal mod shop that stocks every part for every car. You've got to go to specialty tuners that work on your make and model. On paper, this all probably sounds really boring, but in practice, it's one of the most compelling formulas for an open-world racer I've ever experienced. When I make decisions in Unlimited, my mindset borders on role-playing. I pick interior colors I feel best suit the car's personality. I shell out thousands of dollars for premium wheels and paint, because if I'm buying a Ferrari, I'm buying a Ferrari, dammit, what's another couple grand? I found myself making purchasing decisions based on the type of car I'd like to own. Not race, but own. There is no benefit to owning a convertible in Unlimited. They're slower and they cost significantly more than their coupe counterparts. But almost every time I was given an option, I chose the Roadster, because it fits the type of lifestyle I want my character to live. The same way I'd decorate a room in Animal Crossing to resemble a kitchen, I organize my car collection, so my $1 million home's garage contains nothing but Italian sports cars and luxury sedans, while the classic muscle and American Roadsters share a house on the other side of Oahu. Like in Animal Crossing, this is a purely aesthetic pursuit. It serves no gameplay purpose, but in the moment, it feels like the right thing to do. On the subject of the game's map, Oahu is the perfect setting for the game Unlimited is trying to be. Hawaii wouldn't really work in many other racing games, especially not those of a 2006 vintage. The island may be gorgeous in real life, but it's not terribly interesting to look at in digital form. As much flack as games like Need for Speed catch replacing snow-capped mountains, dense forests, and desert plains within spitting distance of each other, Unlimited puts into perspective why decisions like that were made. Especially in the days before day-night cycles and dynamic weather, Oahu contains little to see beyond blue skies, green trees, and gray asphalt. But Hawaii is very real, That's not to say it's a one-to-one recreation, but it's close enough to be believable. Oahu really does look like this, and what the map lacks in visual variety, it replaces with context. Not a story per se, but certainly a canon reason for the player to be there and to do the things they do. Your character has the means to leave their life behind, move to Oahu, and live a life of automotive luxury. Money isn't a concern. You show up with 200 grand in a suitcase to get yourself established. Whatever money you earn from racing is play money. You're filthy stinking rich, and living a life that most could never even dream of. Absurd? Absolutely. But it works, for the same reason we all grew up with pictures of supercars on our walls. The person the player takes control of is hardly a character. They're more a personified justification for the game's premise and mechanics. But while the avatar may not be a character, Oahu certainly is. As repetitive as it can be to actually traverse, Oahu is still unquestionably a tropical paradise. Its open roads and winding mountain passes give meaning to the game's subtitle. Everything about this game complements Eden's choice of locale, from its UI and graphic design to the selection of cars on offer. And all of this works towards the game's mission statement. Give the player the means to live a life without limits, through the lens of luxury car ownership and racing. Not exactly the most original concept, but if any franchise has earned the right to iterate on this idea, it is Test Drive. With a back catalog as thematically incongruous as Test Drive's, you'd be forgiven for forgetting that the series began as an ultra-luxury fantasy simulator, just like Unlimited. Distinctive Software's 1987 game Test Drive was named that for a reason. You're an executive, choosing one of 5 supercars to take on a test drive. I've covered this before when I reviewed Test Drive 6, but to make a long story short, Distinctive and Accolade had a falling out not long after Test Drive's sequel hit shelves. Accolade sued Distinctive, lost, and the developer promptly left for greener pastures, straight into the arms of Electronic Arts, where they became EA Canada and created the Need for Speed. By the new millennium, Test Drive was largely playing an imitation game. Accolade was sold to Infogram, which was itself sold to Atari, 3 names that tell a horror story of their own. This is the same Atari that royally fucked up the most expensive video game of all time. The very same Atari that found itself embroiled in one of the first scandals in games journalism. Under Atari, the Test Drive brand gradually faded. The schedule changed from 3 or 4 games a year to just 1. After an unsuccessful reboot and the ousting of longtime developer Pitbull Syndicate, Test Drive was seemingly done. The final Test Drive game of this era was 2003's Eve of Destruction, and while it may have reviewed well, it didn't sell. Atari came to the painfully obvious conclusion that Test Drive's name was too tainted to succeed, and slapping it onto otherwise good games would only do further damage to the brand. Reviving Test Drive would take much more than a decent game, but Atari simply couldn't afford to forego for a blank check. Test Drive was not in good hands. But after Pitbull was sold to Midway, Atari did at least have the sense to throw the metaphorical keys to a company that did know what they were doing. The recipients? Eden Games, of V-Rally fame. Information on Test Drive Unlimited's development is sparse, and I've not been able to figure out when work started. But at the very least, a good portion of the franchise's 3-year hiatus was spent deciding what type of game it would be. The franchise didn't go full circle by coincidence, but despite the best intentions of all parties involved, Unlimited's budget was still, well, limited. Some of the cars in this game are just not accurate, as if the designers were eyeballing it from low-resolution photographs. No, it's clear most of the budget here went to licensing the cars in the first place, and towards the game's online features. Unlimited can be played offline, and if you're playing the console version in 2021, you don't really have a choice. The servers are long gone, but back in the day, taking TDU online turned it into an MMO, or if you ask Atari, an MOOR, massively open online racing. The game would seamlessly place other human drivers in your free roam world. You could challenge them to an impromptu race, or add each other as friends to trade or sell cars. Sound familiar? TDU was neither the first car PG nor the first car MMO, but it was the first one to combine MMO gameplay with single-player content of this depth. Eden is undoubtedly responsible for the whole subgenre now occupied by the likes of The Crew and Forza Horizon. Whether you thank them or blame them is up to your own taste. Either way, Eden were ahead of their time, but not without compromise. Like I said, you could play this game offline, but it was very clearly designed with the MMO features in mind. A decent portion of the events are only available in multiplayer, and are thus inaccessible today. On PC, you're even warned that the game can't be completed in single player, which, whatever, happens all the time. But in 2006, I suppose they were ahead of the curve on that trend, too. Games can be relaxing, but at the same time, they can demand things of their audience. Learning mechanics and developing skill, or intense mechanical engagement. And if those are the experiences you want, Test Drive Unlimited offers them. But it's also what I call a great podcast game. A game that is simple enough to play while also listening to podcasts or watching YouTube videos, without becoming so trivial that it's unfulfilling. Unlimited can be as deep or as digestible as you're up for any given moment. And I gotta say, Test Drive Unlimited plays closer to a simulator than Forza 4 ever did, no matter the assists. It's never piss easy, but traction and stability control work far more like you expect from a real car. That, combined with the aforementioned purchasing and ownership mechanics, make Test Drive Unlimited one of the most grounded and satisfying driving experiences of the 7th generation, at least about 80% of the time. For that other 20%, you'll be dealing with indestructible bushes and lampposts, rubber banding police cruisers, traffic that pops into existence right before your eyes, collision physics that better resembles super bouncy balls than cars. And the bikes. The bikes! Listen, I love that Eden wanted to include motorcycles, and admittedly, my taste is more road rash than tourist trophy. I will be the first to admit that I don't know shit about motorcycles. But god, these things don't feel good. They're certainly more realistic than other depictions, but that isn't necessarily a good thing. Unlimited's cars can be enjoyed regardless of your effort or proficiency, but bikes are downright miserable if you make anything resembling a mistake. After spending 20 plus hours with this game, learning how the physics work and discovering every car dealer, I don't want to relearn how to play all over again for the sake of enjoying the quote-unquote bonus of motorcycles. I don't know why they're locked until late game either, because bikes are cheap as hell and there are only a few of them. Kawasaki is the only Japanese bike manufacturer. Where are Honda, Suzuki, and Yamaha? And for that matter, where are BMW, Harley, and Indian? This, and the bad handling on the bikes that do exist, likely stem from the same problem: budget. These were features, and licenses, that couldn't be squeezed into this game, which was already as expensive as Atari could afford for a racing game at that time. Bikes are introduced late game because they're so unpolished that they give noobs a bad first impression. Speaking of half-baked, disappointing inclusions, holy shit, these character models are among the worst I've ever seen. The mid-2000s were a bad time for human designs, even in big-budget, character-focused games. I don't know why Eden even attempted it for Test Drive. I'm speculating, but I'm fairly certain we were always meant to play as this guy, not only because he's the default character, but because Eden obviously designed this game for a straight male audience. Hitchhiker and top model missions are the exact same thing. The only difference is the gender of the NPC you ferry around. I would call this sexist, but I'm willing to forgive it because if you pick a female avatar, you get to headcanon that Hawaii is full of lesbians who can't drive. So you get to run around and fulfill your power lesbian fantasies of picking up chicks in a Ferrari, and leaving random men stranded on the side of the road. On a serious note, they shouldn't have given you this many options for a character model, because this is basically every human model in the game. If you pick any of the women, you will interact with your clones in dealerships, clothing stores, and real estate options. And good god, these people are fucking hideous. The animation looks like one of those cursed Nicktoons memes. Driving missions that use these NPCs are basically just time trials anyways, and you're paid not with money, but clothing coupons. These coupons can be used at various licensed clothing stores like Mark Echo Unlimited, no relation. These clothes are all dated the minute they were added to the game, and there are barely any options for female avatars. And what's here looks awful. The only cosmetics I ended up caring about were motorcycle gear, because I couldn't avoid seeing it, and the set you start with is Kill Bill Yellow. But there were so few options I ended up just picking a black suit and never changing out of it. This is a teachable moment for the industry as a whole. Don't half-ass. If you can't afford to do something to at least some baseline of quality, just don't do it. I wouldn't have batted an eye at a racing game from 2006 emitting human NPCs, but I will absolutely notice if these lifeless clumps of pixels do this every time I buy a car. I'll save the rest of this rant for the sequel because suffice it to say, they did not learn their lesson. And apparently, neither did anyone else. This is your fault, Eden. As easy as it is to blame Unlimited for the bad trends that began, I truly believe this game inspired, or at the very least informed, the open-world racing games that followed. In 2006, Oahu was one of the largest maps in a racing game. Circling around its entirety takes nearly an hour, even in the fastest cars. Maps were naturally going to get larger with time, but what I think developers learned from TDU is that making your environment interesting is more important than making it believable. Unlimited's rendition of Oahu may look like the real thing, but that doesn't make it less monotonous to drive through. That's why Worlds and Need for Speed and The Crew are the way they are. They may be dumb when you pick them apart, but in practice, it's more interesting. The open-ended progression gives more imaginative players a generous canvas to fill in, but the trade-off is that it may leave other players feeling a bit lost, for reasons I'll get into a bit later in the video. I don't usually make a habit of talking about modifications when I review a game. I'm somewhat of a purist, it's why I use real hardware and upscalers over emulation. It's also why I typically avoid older PC games. Modern resolutions, higher frame rates, and fan patches are all great, but they tend to break stuff in games of this vintage. My primary playthrough for this video took place on Xbox 360, an RGH console with the delisted DLC restored. My short time with the PC version was enough to lead me to recommend against it. Even with VSync and other suggested fixes in place, I experienced issues with test drive's traffic and police systems that, while not so severe they ruined the experience, are enough to convince me to stick with Xbox. But a few weeks ago, when I announced that I was going to re-review Unlimited, a surprising amount of people requested I take a look at TDU Platinum, a semi-recent fan mod that takes the TDU you know and love and adds over 800 cars, bringing its roster in line with the modern games it inspired. Most of these car models are ripped from other games directly, notably Forza Motorsport 4. The mod also adjusts cash reward amounts, replaces vehicles and delivery missions with new ones, and generally tweaks the economy to account for the massive number of vehicles players can now attain. On top of its own improvements, Platinum comes bundled with Project Paradise, a custom launcher that restores the now defunct online services among other improvements. This means that not only can you experience Oahu with way more cars than Eden ever intended, but you can do it with friends. Well, or at least, you could. But literally a few hours after I wrote that sentence, the server farm literally caught fire and burned down. Rumor has it that it'll take a month or so for services to come back, but man, talk about timing. Platinum is a really cool mod, and I have to give massive kudos to the devs behind it. Unlimited is a difficult game to modify, and its PC port wasn't that great to begin with, and the modder's perseverance speaks to how compelling Eden's original game was. With all of that being said, I absolutely would not recommend it for your first Test Drive Unlimited experience. As awesome as it is to have hundreds of cars from various eras and countries to choose from, being so supremely spoiled for choice really dampened the experience for me. Buying new cars in the vanilla game felt awesome, figuring out what I wanted, where to get it, and what events I need to do to raise the money for it. Weighing my options of selling cars to free space in my garage, or saving for another house to keep them in. These things are possible in Platinum, but they're a lot less likely to happen. In my experience, I didn't grow attached to a car before deciding to buy another. The knowledge that there were over 800 more to drive, and that money is even easier to come by than it already was, led to a cycle of buying a car, doing 2 or 3 races, then trading it in for another. I never felt so attached to vehicles that I decided to spend money on another house rather than just freeing one of my 4 existing slots. This is exacerbated by a car list that can be best described as thematically detached. Unlimited and its contemporaries had smaller car rosters and thus stuck more rigidly to themes than modern games. Each game's selection of vehicles complemented its theme, world, and atmosphere. And much like modern racing games, where the goal is often to please as much of the market as possible, TDU Platinum's quantity before quality approach means the luxury vacationer vibe of the vanilla game is lost, replaced by a sea of Honda Civics, 90s Lexus, and Jeep Wranglers. Don't get me wrong, I love seeing cars like this in new games, but you can't just walk into a dealership and buy a brand new SC300 anymore. The dealerships in Unlimited worked because they were believable. With the exception of concept cars, everything was either a late model, available in real dealerships at the time, or a classic that would periodically go in and out of stock. Making basically every car available at any time makes attaining them feel empty. And if you're wondering why I've not really discussed Platinum's gameplay, well, other than the vehicles and cash reward amounts, nothing has really changed. There are no new events compared to the base game, and the AI are brain dead and incredibly easy to beat. The only other differences I've picked up on are negative ones. Police don't spawn properly. Traffic cars randomly stop as if frozen in place. And not once, not twice, but every single time I did a delivery mission, I hit an invisible car and tainted an otherwise perfect run. None of these things are Platinum's fault. Unlimited has a shoddy PC port and difficult coding to work around, and the developers say that adding new events wouldn't really be possible. So don't take this as me kicking the mob while it's down. Platinum is really cool, but you aren't getting the full TDU experience out of it. My recommendation? Play Unlimited on 360 first, where it will always run properly and relatively bug-free. Then come to PC afterward to see what Platinum is all about. But if you don't have a 360, don't worry. Atari's got you covered. Melbourne House is a studio that has found their way into my videos, and my collection, through a hilarious number of coincidences. They're one of those studios where you buy a game, get it home, and realize it's the 5th game by them you own, despite never being cognizant of that fact before purchase. Melbourne House formed in the early 1980s, and spent most of their life working as a support studio or porting games to other platforms. Games you may be familiar with include Test Drive Le Mans and Transformers for PlayStation 2, the one based on Armada, not the Michael Bay movie. Unlimited's PS2 version marks the final game ever produced under the Melbourne House name. During its production, the company was purchased by Chrome Studios, and subsequently became Chrome Studios Melbourne. Like most port studios, Melbourne House has a somewhat spotted past, but Unlimited, man, what a send-off. This is one of the most impressive driving games on the PlayStation 2. Not only does the PS2 port feature the entirety of Oahu, just like its big sibling, but it also supported online play in the same MMO format. Despite appearances, the PS2 port is a different game in many ways. Since the PS2 was an offline console first, Melbourne House seemed to prioritize that content instead of splitting the design 50-50, which is appreciated since my map isn't polluted with things I can't do. One interesting thing I noticed almost immediately was that the PlayStation 2 port was developed by an English-speaking studio. Event names actually made sense. Eden's events were clearly translated from French without much proofreading for grammar or context. Asphalt Eater and Fratricide Head-to-Head are personal favorites, but the most glaring is Head-to-Head is the only way, which, despite its title, is a 4-way race. Car clubs exist, filled out with NPCs named after beta testers and Eden employees. You'll be gradually invited to them as you level up and buy cars that fit into more categories. For example, Club Stripe, a car club exclusively for owners of vehicles with stripe decals. Huh. The clubs might be a bit silly, but they are an interesting way of spacing out progression and motivating the player to buy new types of vehicles. Overall, I'm still awestruck by how good this version of TDU is. As a kid, I never felt like I was playing a downgraded version, and when I played the 360 version a couple of years later, things weren't so drastically different that it felt like another game. Believe it or not though, this isn't even the most impressive port Unlimited received. Test Drive Unlimited came to PSP. Not in the same way that games like Need for Speed Pro Street came to PSP, where a different game was developed and had the full game's name slapped on it for marketing purposes. No, the entirety of Test Drive Unlimited's PS2 version was brought to Sony's handheld. You lose the cockpit camera, the avatars, and the online player limit is reduced. But this works. This is a very, very good port. Like, Midnight Club 3 levels of good. It really is the exact same game, and by that merit, there isn't too much to be said here that I haven't already said about the PS2 or 360 versions. Test Drive Unlimited is one of those games where every time I come back to it, I find it's held up better than I remember. The last time I played through this game was 2017, when I made that awful video. Just a couple days before starting the playthrough for this new video, I was sitting in a Discord call with some friends when the game came up in discussion. I remarked that I thought this game's progression was sloppy and uninteresting, and disagreed with my friend's reference for the car roster. I went into this new playthrough expecting those memories to be reaffirmed. I thought that what I'd end up doing was essentially going to be a remaster of my original review. The fear that I'd end up just repeating myself into a better quality microphone kept me from playing this game again for a very long time. But within a couple hours of getting off that plane, I was in love with Oahu all over again. I bought cars I don't think I even saw last time through. I liked this game last time, but this time, I loved it. So, what changed? Unlimited didn't. This is the same hard copy I bought on my first trip to a local game store I now visit almost weekly. There certainly haven't been any patches or content updates in that time. That's the thing. The game didn't change. I did. When I bought this game 4 years ago, I was a kid. I was freshly 18, walking into a store I'd never been to in a city where I just moved for college. I knew basically no one in town, I was working a shitty fast food job, and I didn't have all that much faith that college was for me. I had a girlfriend, but she stayed behind in my hometown, and like most high school relationships, it crumbled before the end of my freshman year. I was going through the motions. Class, work, downtime, sleep. Unsure. Isolated. Alone. I don't even remember what I was looking for in that shop, but I know I found it. I didn't realize it at the time, but there was a reason I grabbed Unlimited off the shelf that day. As exciting as your first slice of independence can be, it's also scary. My life had been completely uprooted, and in a time where I had nowhere familiar to go when things got to be a lot, both literally and figuratively, returning to Oahu was that comforting escape. You know those little memories you get? Those fleeting snapshots of time that you don't really know why you remember them, but you feel your whole body relax a little when you think of them? An insignificant amount of time, maybe 3 seconds, where you remember everything you saw, heard, and felt? I have that for this game. I remember the start of winter break, 2007. The Christmas tree is up, the house is cold. The tile floors are bare because the rugs are all in the wash, and I can hear my mom vacuuming, getting ready for the onslaught of family that we'll be visiting over the next 2 weeks. And there I was, on the couch, PS2 controller in hand, playing Test Drive Unlimited. I even remember the car, a yellow Saturn Sky. In that moment, everything was normal, comfortable, secure, safe. Everyone I knew was either there with me, or I'd see them over the coming weeks. I had no worries, no responsibilities, school was out till January, and 8-year-olds don't have jobs. I guess it's not so surprising that I was drawn to this game in that day in 2017. Comfortable, secure, and safe were the opposite of my feelings. I was alone in a new town, with everyone and everything I'd ever known hours away by car. And in this game, I found comfort when I needed it. For all the hell I give myself for that old video, I think it very much reflects where I was as a person at that point in my life. I was trying something new, completely foreign to me. My audio was terrible, I constantly misspoke and didn't bother editing it out. Not that the writing was any good to begin with. Reflections of my 18-year-old self even come across in the criticisms of the game. The way I said the game lacked direction, where I didn't know what I was supposed to do because the game didn't give me a big flashing arrow towards the next objective. I don't think I need to unpack that statement to show how it lines up with who I was at that point in time, but I suspect those of you with your teens behind you know exactly what I mean. But it's been nearly 4 years, and I couldn't be more different. I've gone from that scared, closeted kid with no sense of purpose to a proud woman with some vague idea of what I want to do with my life, and who I want to do it with. I went from, and I promise this will loop back around to test drive, I went from a tiny 10x8 dorm room to an apartment, and by this time next year, I hope to be in my first real house. I'm not saying I have everything figured out. Most of the time, I still feel like I'm flying by the seat of my pants. But I've had time to figure out who I am, what matters to me, and what I want from this deceptively short game called life. I'm not saying I'm gonna move to Hawaii and buy a Koenigsegg, but some part of me acknowledges the beauty in the same game that comforted a scared 18-year-old with no idea what life had in store for her, later allowing her to dream about what she might do now that she does. Parts of Unlimited that left me confused and demotivated now inspire me to blaze my own trail through Oahu's miles of tarmac. Test Drive Unlimited is proof that media can hold meaning beyond its creator's intent, and that meaning is never static. Because neither are we. Jesus Christ. How do you even do this?
Take one.
Scratch this disc up by the end of it.
Oh, Ellie, I'm so sorry for what we were about to do.
No idea what's... Where did that one even drop go? There it is.
It's beautiful.